All right, so in the previous video, we made a simple form that told us the color we inputted. Worked like this. Something I forgot to mention is that you don't actually need the form to be able to access this, right? Because the way that I set up the route, if I were to change this here, and just go to this page where I access the route and I set the fave color to yellow, this will actually also say your favorite color is yellow. That's something to point out. Also, I forgot a semicolon. So I wanted to call attention to that so that if you're following along, you don't get any errors because of a missing semicolon. So what we're going to do now is practice using sessions. And the way that we're using it right now is not really necessary. It's just to demonstrate an example. So let's say that I wanted to create a new route so that did something similar to here, right? But that didn't require any queries. So that if I said my fave color, it would still tell me what that favorite color was. But again, without a query. So we don't want to have to use this. We want to be able to just have that saved somewhere. So how do we do that? We can do that with the use of cookies, more explicitly with the use of sessions. So I have here the documentation for regular express and then express session because I do want to highlight a couple of things. Super important to read the documentation of any APIs that you use. Important to note that the newest version, so a lot of the readings that I gave you for class talked about using the cookie parser middleware. That's because the readings are a little out of date. Since the newest version, or actually we're past this version, but since version 1.5, you no longer need that cookie parser middleware, and it's actually recommended that you do not use it. So you're going to keep doing everything the same way that you were doing before, except you're just not going to use cookie parser. So I wanted to do a video showing that example because all of the readings that I gave you did use the cookie parser. The only thing to note is that the information that you're storing in this case is not stored in the cookie itself, just the session ID. And the reason that that matters is because if you were to, for example, try to debug via DevTools by looking at the cookie, you would never see the information that you're storing in the session because that's not getting stored there anyway. So just keep that in mind, and I'll show you what that looks like in just a moment, where you're going to have a cookie, but it's not going to have any of the information that you are storing in your session because that information is stored on the server side. So on the one hand, that makes it a little more secure because I can't go in and modify the cookie and pretend to be someone that I'm not. On the other, it does make it a little harder to debug. The other thing to keep in mind is that this using express session by itself is fine to use for our purposes of doing practice problems in class just to get comfortable using sessions. But if you want to use this for your actual portfolio site or for a final project, you want to make sure that, once you post it onto, for example, if you end up using Heroku, you want to make sure that you're not using just that alone. You want to use these compatible session stores that don't cause memory leaks. So that's super important to note. So again, this is good. It's all fun and games while we're doing practice problems, but we want to make sure that we don't leak any memory, that we don't does not scale past a single process. So if two people tried to access this, it would not work if two people tried to access it at the same time. Again, for the intended purposes of what we're doing, we're just working for the most part locally, and the only reason that you're posted it on Heroku is for the lab, is for us to be able to give you feedback on it. And so it's fine if, there's going to be tiny memory leak and there's only ever going to be a single process. But for scalability and in terms of moving forward, if you actually wanted to use sessions, you would want to use these. And they actually give you a link of potential options here. You have tons of options here. So just so that you know and can think about for your final project. All right, so like I said, I have here the documentation, which I'll put a link to in the chat or in the description below. Let me make a new folder. It's going to be HTML form session. And let me copy everything from before into this new form, or into this new folder, excuse me. And new dash R to make it recursive. Capital R. You want the R at the front, that's fine. Doesn't want it. There we go. Fifth time's the charm. Okay, so now let me go into this new folder. You'll see I just copied essentially everything over into this new folder. So let me open up this folder. So I just want the app.js. Let me close the old one so I don't get confused. All right, so I accidentally modified that other one. I'll have to remember to go back. Okay, so we had talked about creating this new route where we store we store the favorite color of our user so that we're able to tell them their favorite color again without them having to input it per se. So we're going to have to use our session, express session. Which means we also need to install that session. So let's do an npm install express session. Awesome. Okay, so when we have a session, oh, there I go, forgetting semicolons again. When we have a session, we want to give it a secret key. So we're going to tell our app to use session and because again, we're doing this just locally to practice with, we can give it a bad secret key. So now that we have a session, we have access to modifying the session and creating new attributes for it. So let's say, so what I want to do is I want to save that favorite color, right? And the session is actually a part of the request. So when the user now accesses our page, they're going to have a cookie created that's going to last the duration for however long they are on our page, unless we give it a different max age, which is number of milliseconds before it disappears. And actually, let me show you before I move on really quickly. With our old page, so if I go back to what we had before, and let me actually make sure that I get rid of that this guy that we're not using here. So this is the old one that we had from the previous video. So let's say that I run this and I access localhost 3000. If I do an inspect element, Okay, so if we run our old form, and we go into inspect element, we see that if you go into storage and inspect element, you can actually see the cookies and the storage being used by the current page. You'll see there's nothing there, right? There's no cookies, there's no local storage, there's no session storage because we're not using any cookies on this page. So that is the behavior that we expect. Now, if we were to, and we're not necessarily done with this yet, so actually let me comment this one. But now that we're setting up a session with this new project, let's kill this one and go ahead and run this one. Must have spelled secret key wrong. Let's look at the documentation. Oh, it's just secret. Still does not like. Oh, we need colon because it's a JSON. There we go. All right, you'll see we're getting some errors here or some notes of things that have been deprecated, so we can modify those shortly. But let's go back to this guy. And you'll see that now we're running the app that creates a session. You'll see that we now, if we, the moment we refreshed, we actually got a cookie here. This is our cookie that expires when our session ends. It has a value. These values are unique, right? This is the ID of the specific cookie. And there's nothing else. But we do have this cookie being used here. It's not secure, right? We didn't specify anything about being secure. The default is HTTP only. And so here we see this information. What I was talking about earlier when I said, that whenever you add variables or information to store into the session, it's not going to show up here because it's not being stored on the cookie itself. It's being stored on the server side. So you'll see that as I make changes and I start storing stuff using the session, it's not going to show up here. So that's why debugging this can get a little tricky. So let's go back to what we were doing. So like I said, the session belongs to the request. So to access that, we would say rec.session. And like I said, I wanted to create this new attribute for the session that stores the favorite color so that I can use it later on. So to do that, I just create it and assign it a value. And I want it to be the same value when I first get the response. So let me kill the server and restart it. And I'll refresh this. And I'll give it a favorite color. You'll see nothing changed. Right? So it's hard to know whether this is actually working or not because it's not storing it on the client side. This is the client side, but it is storing it on the server side. So the only real way we can test if this works is if afterwards we try to print this via our console. So let's do that. Let's kill our server, start it again. Go back to the home page. Purple. Submit again, and nothing changed here. Here we got purple. So okay. Allegedly looks like it's working. So let's try to use it in our other route. Let's get rid of this because we're not using it. So the favorite color is stored here. So let's use that. And I'll say it was so that we know that we hit the right route. So let's kill this. Actually, before we do that, let's deal with these. So undefined resave option, provide resave option. So what is that? Let's look it up. Okay, so here we have what the resave option is. Oh, excuse me. So here we have what the resave option is. Our store does not implement the touch method, so therefore we'll likely need resave true. So let's set our resave to true. Remember, this is a JSON, so we separate those with commas and then assign that via the colon. And then save on initialized option. Okay, let's look for that. On initialized. Okay, so here's information on this. The default is true, but using the default has been deprecated as the default will change in the future. The session is uninitialized when it is new but not modified. Choosing false is useful for implementing login sessions, reducing server-side storage, or complying with all or call permission for setting a cookie. Choosing false will also help with race conditions where a client makes multiple parallel requests without a session. All right, so let's use false. Actually, let me copy that because I know I'm going to spell it incorrectly. Save on initialize. We're setting this to false. All right, so now we can clear this out. Make sure. Yay, no more warnings. Okay, so let's go back to here. All right, so favorite color, yellow. Your favorite color is yellow. Again, look, our cookie is not changing because this is being stored server side, not client side. And I forgot the name of a route. My fave color. So color received only works when you have a query, right? If you do this, it's going to be undefined because it's looking for that query and we didn't give it to them. But if you give it the query and say favorite color / yellow, then that works. The goal is for my fave color to still say yellow despite not having that query because we stored that information in our session. So let's see if that works. That did not work. My favorite color was undefined. Okay, so let's make sure that wasn't because of all my backwards and forwards that I did. Favorite color is blue. My favorite color, yeah, that's still undefined. Okay. So we're not getting, this isn't being saved, and I promise it took me longer than I'm showing in the video. I realize what's happening is actually when you call res.send, it's the same if you remember as doing res.write and res.end. So the client is actually ending, or the server is saying, hey, this connection's over, I'm done. And then it tries to modify the session of the request, but it's already ended that, it's already ended the communication. So we need to put this up here before we tell it that the connection is over so that it actually modifies that session that belongs to the request, then ends it, and then we can access it here. So let's try this again. And, oh, Now what was I? Not that. Localhost. Favorite color, red. And then we were trying to access my fave color. Favorite color was red. There we go. All right, and if you're wondering how I debugged it, took me staring at a couple of other examples that I had done in the past already and realizing that I was modifying the request. But the only difference that I had really was that I was modifying the request after I had done my send rather than before. So to recap, you want to make sure you're modifying your request's session before you send. And then once you modify that, now this exists in this session, right? There's a fave color attribute stored in the session that you can now use in other pages. And you'll see that even if I refresh here, right, again, there's no parameters going on here, but the red is still there because I stored it in my session. All right, so hopefully that was helpful.